Hey, beautiful nerds. Thank you for tuning in to the High Fantasy Podcast. This is your co-host, Morgan, and today we have finally released our third installment of the Lord of the Rings epic book and film discussion series. This is a conversation on the Return of the King that Shalini and I recorded nearly 2 years ago. Man, where did the time go? It was really cool to go back in time a bit and see just how pronounced our love of Tolkien and Peter Jackson's adaptations was. It was also cool to realize how much our cast has changed and how much we've actually learned about this genre in that time. For example, at one point in this episode, we discussed the ending of the Lord of the Rings books versus Jackson's film trilogy, and what a good epic fantasy ending actually entails. We posited that while both endings included a stern message about what the effects of war and violence are, it was basically a happy and positive one overall. Well, since this recording, we saw the Game of Thrones TV series come to a breathtakingly bad and very dark end, in our opinion at least, and it was really striking to hear us say that basically all high fantasy stories entail an epic struggle with a happy-ish ending. From Thrones alone, this has really shaken our perspective. Yes, A Song of Ice and Fire can be argued to be more a dark fantasy, and indeed, George R.R. Martin has not released his sixth book as of uploading this episode, so we don't know what his real ending is, and many people do not like comparing Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones at all. But I think this point cannot be ignored. What is high fantasy anyway, for real? We will definitely be revisiting that question, and as we mentioned at the end of this episode, we have a lot more Tolkien to discuss. Woot woot. And perhaps we'll identify some not so happy and not so glorious endings in his other works. Anyhow, without any further ado, hope you enjoy this episode, and thanks again for tuning in. Cheers. Hooah!
Yeah. Hey, what's up?
Not much. How are you doing today, Shalini?
Pretty good. I'm hyped on some black tea.
Some of that black tea.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You know, for the Return of the King podcast. Rah, rah.
So in this episode, we conclude our epic discussion of the Lord of the Rings with the Return of the King, the third volume.
And probably the most epic movie of them all.
Indeed.
It did win about 11 Academy Awards, I think.
It was some major shit.
Yeah. And I remember they played at the Golden Globes for that year. They played Into the West, like the closing credits song at the Golden... Oh, no, not the Golden Globes.
Really?
The Academy Awards, yeah. Oh. They brought Annie Lennox, who's the vocalist for that. And yeah, she sang it there. And I think they had like a montage of like shit going on in the background of like Into the West. And I think they also had, like, this funny, like, scene with Gollum. He appeared on the screen and he was like, hey, where's my Oscar, precious? Like, it was Andy Serkis, like, pretending to be Gollum. And, like, but it was actually Gollum. It was, like, the way that he looks in the movies. So, yeah, it was a big deal for that year.
Yeah,
movies.
Hugely successful. And funny enough, I think it had the smallest budget because it was only it was 94 million. This is Wikipedia, 94 million according to Wikipedia budget, but box office made $1.120 billion.
$100 billion.
That's crazy.
That is fucking crazy.
Wow.
And a running time 200 minutes.
That's like that's 10 times more than what they spent.
That's insane.
Yeah.
That is an incomprehensible amount of money to make on a film.
I hope those Weta Workshop guys saw a good load of that there.
Yeah.
That 1.12 billion.
You have to think though, like how much of that went to pay.
Yeah.
Because there's these people who are being paid, and there's a team of 3,000 people who worked on the films.
Yeah.
In total, or if not more.
Yeah, probably more.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a crazy amount of people. And we're going to talk a bit about what they went through and what they've created for the movie in this podcast.
Mm-hmm. And we're also going to focus a lot more on the actual book. Like, we're going to read a couple excerpts because we want to really pay attention to the use of language.
Yeah.
Because this film, in my view, and I think like we both kind of agree on this, is probably one of the most close in terms of adaptation to the novel, I feel. There are obviously some things that are different, and we're going to talk about those different things.
But also what's interesting is that they, like the teams on Peter Jackson's sort of design and production team were just kind of, they used descriptions that were kind of vague in terms of Tolkien's like writing, and they made it into something that you look at and you're like, that's exactly what it should look like. And we'll talk a bit about the beasts and whatnot that appear in the movie. So, overall sort of question, which ending was more appropriate to conclude the story? The movie ending or the book ending? And this is kind of why we wanted to focus on the literature and the writing in the book, and kind of delve into Tolkien's side of things as well as the film.
So a brief synopsis. The movie opens with Smeagol fighting Deagle. Smeagol's our favorite character, in case you don't know. Our favorite character.
Love those big eyes and fishy lips and annoying voice.
So we get a bit of a backstory as to how Smeagol came upon the ring initially. And then, of course, it cuts to the current predicament.
Frodo and Sam are still in the middle of shit nowhere with Gollum, who's the best companion you could ever have. What's happening on the Fellowship side?
Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas are with King Theoden and the army of Rohan. Some unfortunate things happen, and Gandalf has to carry away Merry all the way to Minas Tirith.
It's Pippin.
Fuck! Right. I knew there was something
if
wrong.
We have bloopers, we have to put that one in. It's Pippin.
Gandalf has to carry away Pippin all the way to Minas Tirith because he went ahead and looked into the Palantir.
Yeah, he's a Palantir addict.
Yeah.
Like most of us.
Yeah, I have a lot of Palantirs in the room.
Yeah, I just really want to go look at it right now.
Yeah. You have a craving.
It's the phone. It's the iPhone. It's the Palantir.
Oh, it's a metaphor for technology.
Just as the ring.
They actually talk about that in the extended thing. In case you haven't noticed, we talk a lot about the extended behind the scenes crap.
Yeah.
It's really, really amazing. The Palantir from the point, or at least from the point of view of Peter Jackson's team, is a symbol of miscommunication because each character that looks into it is seen by Sauron, and Sauron believes that person has the ring when they don't have the ring.
Yeah. Or Saruman looks into the Palantir and communicates with Sauron, and he immediately comes to the conclusion that, I can benefit from Sauron's reign. When we all know that, if Sauron becomes powerful, he's not going to share power with anyone. And Gandalf says basically the same thing to him. And Saruman's like, no, I don't believe that.
Well, because he's too arrogant to believe such a thing.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so anyway, funny enough, in the entire story, the Palantir are only mentioned 3 or 4 times.
Yeah, it's 4 times.
4 times total.
Yeah.
But they play a pretty, I'd say, a significant part in the films. I mean, they don't have a great impact in terms of story progression, but they do have a lot, a big part of, I think, character development.
Yes, definitely.
The most notable being when Aragorn stares right into it and confronts Sauron directly.
Yeah.
Because at this point, we know that, Aragorn is really the king, and he's going to come back. It's in the title. But Sauron is aware now that Aragorn is the heir to the throne of Gondor. And there's that confrontation. And again, Sauron believes that Aragorn has the ring. And so it's to the advantage of the Fellowship to Frodo and Sam, because they're not being suspected anymore.
That's really realized in the way that they did the film, because the eye of Sauron, on the tower, was looking directly at Frodo and Sam at one point, and Frodo does this ballerina drop onto the ground.
Oh my god, it's the weirdest take in almost all the films. Yeah.
And then Sauron swerves his eye and goes to the gate, the Black Gate, to look at Aragorn. And that's a really cool sort of realization of what the Palantirs actually fooled him to believe.
Yeah. So anyway, enough about Palantir. So eventually the siege of Gondor begins because the armies of Mordor disperse, and there's some thing where Faramir ends up going and riding out to battle, and they stupidly charge with cavalry. So they're on horseback, but they go towards a fortified position where there's a bunch of archers. So even if they got up close, they couldn't do anything because they're on horseback. Like you can't just crash into like the ruins of a city with. Yeah. Anyway, I thought it was a really annoying scene because you can tell that like I guess they maybe wanted it to seem like it was ludicrous, like the attack that they were doing. Yeah. And it's just Faramir just basically being suicidal, I think.
Yeah. I think it's to show the point of Lord Denethor's sort of view of war and how he's like hiding behind his army, and he's like in this giant, like literally ivory tower. Basically, and it's made out of marble.
Big like, white tower.
Yeah, and he's eating his tomatoes, and it's like dripping blood like down his chin.
Oh, he eats like such an asshole.
Oh god, and the chicken. Anyway,
breaking bones while his son and his men are getting just like massacred.
Yeah, and like his idea of war is like honor and like arrogance, really, right? Because he wants to maintain Osgiliath. For the purpose of maintaining Osgiliath. It's not to, this is really a strategic point, so like we can do this and like take over our lands. It's more like, no, this is your brother Boromir had this city under control and you've messed it up. You have to go and reclaim it back for the realms of men. So it really shows like the ludicrousness of certain tactics of war. Men in their ivory towers don't realize the repercussions of their own hubris.
Meanwhile, Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas go into the mountain of the dead, or whatever it's called.
Yeah, it's the caverns. Caverns below the mountain of Dwimmerberg. Dwimmerberg. Kafilka fish. If any of you have seen Rush Hour 2, is it?
Yeah, Rush Hour 2.
Yeah, Chris Tucker has a.
I'm so glad they didn't put that into the movie. It's so aggravating.
Kafilka fish.
Yeah. So in the novel, they actually have Elladan and Elrohir with them, which is Arwen's brothers. But for the film, it's just the three, and they confront the King of the Dead and all that kind of jazz, and they do some freaky shit test where it's like, here, if you can survive all these skulls falling down on you, then we'll join you. So,
nice shit test.
They come out, and I actually kind of like the scene when they escape the cave, because Aragorn is just so utterly distraught, and like he has such a despair. But then the King of the Dead appears, and he's like, yeah, okay, we'll fight with you. Yeah.
Aragorn's like, really?
Yeah, because they have to fulfill their oaths to the actual King of Gondor, which is Aragorn, because he has the special sword. Of course, this is a hugely important part of the story because they are like the deciding factor in the battle, at least in my view, because they do quite a lot to help. Yeah,
they do a lot of damage since they can't be killed.
Well put. Yeah, they're literally ghosts.
Yeah, but somehow they can attack mortal flesh.
And later we have that great scene, which is the lighting of the beacons with the fantastic, fantabulous, super awesome music.
Yes.
The soundtrack.
Chore. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just awesome. Rohan comes to the aid of Gondor. Then the Battle of Pelennor Field ensues. The armies of Mordor and them clash. And then like the Corsairs and the people from Harad and I think from Rune and from Khand even come.
Oh, really?
Yeah. In the film, they just kind of show Harad. They don't really show the other factions that are there. But despite that, as I mentioned in the beginning, the description of Pelennor Field matches very closely with the film. Like, I think that Peter Jackson's interpretation was like just really, really good. It's definitely faithful in many ways. Certain encounters, like for instance, like there's Éowyn and then the Witch King of Angmar. The death of Theoden.
Yeah, and I think Tolkien also talks about the Rohirrim encountering the Momakil. Well, they were not familiar with this kind of foe, right? This like giant, like elephants, basically. Like these horse people are not like accustomed to like attacking anything that's larger than like a freaking horse.
And horses are scared of elephants, of course. Yeah, right? like regular elephants, not ones, let alone ones that are like 3 times the size, have spiky shit all over them, and they have like a troop of guys on top that are firing arrows and throwing spears. Yeah. And so, of course, to wrap up, the battle is won. They go to the Black Gate. Sauron sends out the dude with the creepy mouth to talk. Frodo and Sam, all the while, end up getting into Mount Doom. Smeagol ends up fighting, blah, 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 blah. Smeagol falls into the fire. The ring is destroyed.
Frodo loses a finger.
Yeah.
Very important. But you forgot Shelob.
Oh, yes, this big, giant, glaring inconsistency. Shelob's lair was actually in the second book, The Two Towers. And for purposes of chronology, was included in the third film to be kind of like another climax, scary moment within the film.
Yes.
There's a final stand where Aragorn and his party are there. Frodo and Sam have just destroyed the ring. And Mount Doom blows up, and Tower of Barad-dûr falls over. And then, there's about 7 different endings up until the end when Frodo goes away to the Grey Havens with Elrond and the remaining elves in Middle-earth. The Third Age comes to an end. Sam, Merry, and Pippin return home. And things are presumably okay.
Yes. So this is kind of the groundwork for what we're going to talk about, which is the question of the ending. So in the book, they actually end very Silmarillion-ly. They actually end very closely. So the last line of the book is the last line of dialogue in the film. But they do in the film miss out a key sort of scene that Tolkien added, which is the scouring of the Shire, when Saruman and Wormtongue, who are still alive at this point, they come with like a ragtag team of like brigands.
They're like wild men and like ruffians and shit. Yeah.
So they come to like take over the Shire, and they basically succeeded, but then like the Hobbit militia like rouse themselves after like 500 years of like not holding a sword or anything, and they kind of just beat them back, and Saruman is killed much in the same way as he's killed in the movie, because Grima Wormtongue just kind of stabs him because
just kind of stabs him.
Kind of, because like I don't know, Saruman's kind of a bully, and we talked about how he's a bit of a Hitler figure.
Kind of a douchebag,
yeah,
like Hitler douchebag figure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and then he gets shot full of arrows. Wormtongue, that is, actually.
Oh.
So that kind of fizzles out.
Yeah. So we're going to talk a bit about why that scene wasn't included in the epic film that is Return of the King, and if that was appropriate or not. But until then, we will go into our basic questions, which we've covered in each of the podcasts.
What's your favorite scene?
So I think my favorite scene is probably, I can't not love the Éowyn scene where she kills the Witch King of Angmar. I think that was like beautifully shot, and it was just so high tension because the Witch King just looks like, just looking at him you feel like daggers are like going up your forearms or something, like it's something like really dangerous looking about him. So the fact that like she's even going up against a being like this is just really scary, and you know that like she'll probably prevail at the end, but it's still really scary to watch. And also the dialogue is awesome, and I am no man, and then she like screams and stabs him. It's just great.
The way it reads in the book is a little bit different, so you will go ahead and grace us with this lovely excerpt. Return of the King by J.R.R. Tolkien.
Then Mary heard of all sounds in that hour the strangest. It seemed that Durmhelm laughed, and the clear voice was like the ring of steel. But no living man am I. You look upon a woman. Éowyn I am, Éowyn's daughter. You stand between me and my lord and king. Begone, if you be not be deathless. For living or dark and dead I will smite you, if you touch him.
Damn.
Yeah. So at that point, the Witch King of Angmar is actually kind of scared. In the book,
poor Witch King.
Yeah, he's like, oh no,
I have all this spiky stuff on me. She's not scared anymore.
basically.
And then he gets stabbed through the face in the movie.
Yeah, and I think it kind of happens here too. So Mary stabs him in the back with a sword, and then Eowyn does the whole "I am no man," and then like stabs him in the face, and that basically happens in the books as well. But to speak more about Eowyn, when I read this scene, I kind of remembered like Shakespeare. And if you have read a lot of Shakespeare, you would know that there's a lot of like gender bending sort of characters, and that's a big flipping point in the dramas. In that like a woman is usually dressed up as a man, and then like it's revealed that she's actually a woman, and she's just seeking a different sort of agency, and that's why that she like did that.
Merchant of Venice, they had that.
Yes.
Some others.
I just thought that it was kind of interesting that there was this sort of Shakespearean turn, because the fact that Durnhelm is a woman is very important, and it's very important that Eowyn is taking up what she thinks is her destiny, which is not to be caged and to fight for her lands, just as any other Rohan man would do. And also in the way that Tolkien actually wrote the scene, it also sounds Shakespearean in a way, like, but no living man am I. Like, that sounds like, it sounds like a iambic pentameter thing that Shakespeare would have, like, concocted up, you know? Yeah. So Tolkien writes in that kind of, like, oldish kind of way anyway. What's your favorite scene?
Well, my favorite scene is when Merry and Gandalf walk into the Citadel, and then there's grumpy cat-faced Denethor sitting right there. Denethor. I like it because I really dislike Denethor. He's such a sourpuss, fatalistic douche. Yeah. And you have Gandalf and Merry's... fuck! I said Merry again. Oh my god. No. He's almost willing to sabotage his entire realm. For some, I don't know. I still don't understand why he is the way he is. He just has no belief anymore that Sauron can be defeated. And he's just convinced that because Boromir is dead and his other son is like not measuring up to this standard that he has, this crazy standard, that all hope is just lost. And like, you know, the ring, we have no idea where the ring is, and it's all over. Anyway.
Yeah. I think the book actually has this thing. Oh, well, in the behind the scenes, they actually talk about this, where Denethor is kind of, he wants to stay stagnant or unchanging, but the world around him is changing. Like, even that's what the siege is all about.
Yeah,
right?
he's stubborn, right? Like,
yeah,
he's willfully ignorant in a way of the gravity of what's happening just outside of like the city walls. Even
though he has a Palantir, like, come on. Yeah.
I really like, though, the description in the book, because, again, you know, it matches very closely in the film. And the set that they used for the palace is just, like, it's amazingly beautiful. Yeah. Like, but it's very simple, because it's, like, a simple black and white, like, marble kind of feel. They have these statues of the past kings of Gondor. The great big throne, you know, that's vacant, and then there's Denethor sitting on like that shitty black chair that's right there. And it's a very solemn place, but it has a lot of history to it, and it has like a special place in Middle Earth, in the world of men, you know. Yeah. Gandalf comes. I come with tidings, you know, and then of course Denethor. I can't tell you how much I dislike him. Despite everything that Gandalf tells him, like, he essentially goes, nah, whatever. Yeah. He's like, my son is dead. Yeah.
This is like, it's understandable, but like, come on.
I'm like, gonna light myself on fire and then throw myself off the edge of the
tower.
Yeah. I love that shot where he just falls on.
And it's so insignificant. He just falls.
Because there's this giant siege going on. Yeah. Dumbass.
And then again, that goes back to like that idea of like being in an ivory tower, and like you don't even think about the repercussions of telling your men to go and fight, and then you see him falling from his ivory tower like this like flaming little matchstick, and then like all around him is just like, this is what you have wrought with chaos. Your stupidity. Yeah. And to go back to the set design of the palace and Minas Tirith, I think throughout this entire, like, I love the sort of ambiance of this entire movie, like how it was shot, at least in like the Gondor side of things, because it has this like bright light into it, like in the set, even though it's like almost purely white because they kind of modeled after like Italian or Roman sort of architecture.
There's also Italian Renaissance inspiration. There's kind of like guild motifs and carved statuettes in the city, and there's also like those medieval hanging signs that indicate like this is where blacksmiths have shops, and this is like a guild headquarters, for example.
Yeah.
A lot of it though is lost in the film because the pace of the scenes, it's really hard to pick up a lot of the finer details.
Yeah, that's very true.
But it's just kind of there, like almost subliminally, and so you kind of pick up, like, yeah, like this is like a really important city.
Yeah.
It's like the Rome of Middle Earth, pretty much. Mm-hmm. And it is very much like a medieval town that's kind of stacked layers on top of each other.
Yeah.
One thing that I'm pretty critical of, though, is how they made the city in the film seem quite like packed. Like there's lots of buildings that are really, really close together.
Yeah.
But I pictured in my own reading like Gondor to be much more grand and big, even though it is on the side of a mountain, like a giant mountain. Yeah. But I still think I thought of it with like big, wide pavilions and that kind of thing. Yeah. I don't think that it does not work. So I think it does work, in other words, to make a double negative a positive. Yeah. I think it works in the film. And perhaps it's good because it gives you that kind of claustrophobic, like, there's a civilization almost packed into the side of a mountain, and then there's this huge plain filled with people that want to destroy it. Yeah. So it gives you that, again, a sense of urgency, and
that's very true.
And I think it does also amplify like the siege feel, because it's hard. It's kind of hard. Like I've seen other films where it'll be a siege of a giant spread out like ancient city or whatnot, and you kind of lose that sense of urgency.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. If you think about some of the shots of like the wide angle shots of the Mordor orcs like marching to the city, most like 3/4 of those shots are just like the dark like black armies of orcs. And then there's like that white shining city, as problematic as those like dichotomy of the colors are, but you see the white shining city in like one like corner of the screen, and you know that it's gonna fall, because look at like these like storms of people who just want to destroy it.
Thankfully it is explicitly not about race.
Oh boy.
Pretty much all the symbolism in the Lord of the Rings is white and black. So to go to the actual battle, there's a great representation of Grond, the giant battering ram. Yes. And again, it's modeled very closely as it is described in the book. So it's this great 100-foot long, huge tree trunk. And in the front is inlaid a hideous metal wolf's head. And in the book, they describe it as being inlaid with spells and like and malice and whatnot. And so I liked it in the film. It has the fiery... like the mouth has fire. I don't know how to describe it. And so every time it strikes the door, it becomes like superheated. And I love that shot when it just comes bursting through the big gate of Gondor. And the guys are like, oh fuck.
And then cave trolls just like come bursting out with them.
And they have like, armor and it's just it is just so
aesthetically pleasing. Like this entire
scary.
movie.
Yeah. And of course, present in the battle is the Witch King of Angmar, which you brought up before. And I really liked how he was represented in the film, of course, because he looks just absolutely menacing and terrifying. But also, I liked, and it's not just in the Return of the King, we see them in the second film as well, which is the great winged beast that the Nazgul ride on. And I'm going to read a little excerpt here from the Return of the King, describing the entrance of the Witch King of Angmar on his great winged beasts. And I think that there was a really faithful interpretation. I actually pictured the winged beasts a little bit differently in terms of looking more like birds, whereas in the film they have almost like a dragony, like worm kind of feel to them, because they have the big long neck. They have the long neck in the book, but for some reason I just thought they'd be more beaky and almost look like pterodactyls or something.
Yeah, me too.
So for context, Theoden is rallying the Airlingas. The great shadow descended like a falling cloud, and behold, it was a winged creature, if bird then greater than all other birds, and it was naked, and neither quill nor feather did it bear, and its vast pinions were as webs of hide between horned fingers, and it stank. You mad? And that's another thing that you don't get from the film. This is as an aside, is you don't get the sense that it must have fucking reeked on Pelennor Fields, because you have this massive army of orcs who probably smell horrible.
Yeah, living.
And
one's dead.
And exactly, but even worse. And you have the great you have the Mumakil, you have the great beasts like those rhinoceros thingies that are in the films, the trolls. Then you have the winged beasts of the Nazgul, which apparently just smell horrific. Yeah. You don't get that from a film, and you can, but when you read it in a book, it's almost like you're prompted more so. I don't know if it's just me or if you experience the same thing.
It's like the fourth dimension, right? That movies still haven't really pierced, which is smell.
Smell of vision.
Yeah, smell of vision.
So continuing. A creature of an older world, maybe it was, whose kind, lingering in forgotten mountains cold beneath the wound, outstayed their day, and in hideous eyrie bred this last untimely brood, apt to evil. And the Dark Lord took it, and nursed it with fell meats, until it grew beyond the measure of all other things that fly, and he gave it to his servant to be his steed. Down, down it came, and then, folding its fingered webs, it gave a croaking cry, and settled upon the body of Snowmane, digging in its claws, stooping its long, naked neck. Just like the most disgusting fucking flying thing you can think of. Yeah. Disgusting.
And it's interesting how the description isn't really necessarily of like, oh, the wings have like this many scales and it's this long and blah, 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 which a lot of fantasy books do these days.
It lets you use your imagination, which is why you come up with a different image in your mind reading it than you do when you see it in the film. And you're like, oh, I pictured it kind of differently. Yeah. And that's like a special thing, I think, because I don't feel like it's always good to have a really slavish interpretation when you're putting it into a film, despite the fact that I like, for so many other things, when the film closely mirrors the book.
Tolkien does like this interesting thing where he describes things through their history, like not exactly as what they look like right now, and he does that with like humanoid characters as well. But here, for example, he uses like how these creatures were bred, like how awfully they were like spawned by Sauron. And from that, you kind of like gain the knowledge of what they kind of look like. And that's such an interesting sort of technique and talent that Tolkien has, that he can like delve into their history and then make it real for us. Yeah. It's like he's doing this two-pronged thing where he makes it seem real because it has this history, but then you can also imagine it because of that history.
Exactly. And it becomes more terrifying, right? Yeah. Because things that are old are just scarier for some reason. I think it's because you can like believe that there's a long record of them doing terrible things and like eating people and flying around and killing crap and you know.
And even these beasts, they're saying maybe there were beasts of old, like of some time ago, like it's still ambiguous like what age they come from. You still get the timeline of Sauron, but it's scary, right? Because no one really knows like what the species is or anything. So
yeah, for all we know, they can be some sort of like twisted, demented dragon spawn from like the first age or something. You know what I mean?
Conspiracy theory.
Well, Morgoth's bred a lot of freaky shit. You get werewolves and vampires and spiders.
Yeah, spiders. Yeah. We know that one.
That's one of the things I think really shine in the Return of the King film. The use of creatures.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure.
Totally. They're more important in this film. In the previous films, it's a lot about like the orcs and about the fellowship, the main characters, and like the orcs are scary in themselves. Here we have like non-humanoid beasts that come to the fore and are really, really menacing. Yeah. And obviously the greatest menaces are the Mumakil, like the Oliphant, big elephant creatures from far Harad.
And I think that's another interesting point about this movie is that it's much more global. So like Fellowship is very localized because they only travel so much.
True.
Like where do they end? They end at Emin Muil, at least for Frodo and Sam. So that's not like terribly far away from the Shire. But then like by Return of the King, you are like all the way down south in Gondor, and then you have the Haradrim who are like from like butt from nowhere. Like there's no map of them either, to our knowledge, to Tolkien's grasp at least. So it is a very more like grand scale that we're introduced to, and we get like this creeping sort of feeling of like all these different beasts and menaces that come to the forefront.
One last character that was really interesting in the films was Gothmog, and of course he's like disgusting. He looks kind of like a pig a little bit.
Yeah, moldy burn victim.
Yeah,
he's a very strange looking orc. He's pale.
Yeah. And a fun fact, Gothmog, the name, is actually Sindarin for strife and hate. And Gothmog originally was the Lord of the Balrogs in the First Age, spawned by Morgoth.
No way.
In Utunmo, the depths, the dark shadow.
Whoa.
You know, when Gandalf brings up, go back to the shadow. That's what he's referring to.
Oh, shit. Yep. He's like, run back to your mommy, basically.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. Go back to Gothmog.
Throw back to the Fellowship of the Ring. Gothmog killed King Fingon, but later was killed by the Lord of Gondolin, Ecthelion.
Right. I love that name, Ecthelion.
Yeah, it's pretty cool sounding.
Yeah. Probably name my son that if we weren't in the 21st century.
Full name, Ecthelion of the Fountain.
Ooh.
Yeah, I named my kid that too. But Gothmog, Lieutenant of Morgul, had a very interesting design process, as we have seen.
Yes, from the behind the scenes videos. Who would have known? Yeah.
The actor is huge though. He's like 6'4", big dude.
He also played the orc that killed Boromir in Fellowship, and he's also the Witch King of Angmar.
There you go.
Yeah. Continuity of like big bad villains. Anyway, so the way that they kind of developed him was just Peter Jackson just put on a whole bunch of plaster onto like the molding that the Weta Workshop had already made, and he like made this grotesque like weird moldy looking creature, and the head designer is like, is this what you want? And Jackson's like, yeah,
he always wanted things to be bigger.
Yeah,
it's funny.
Even this giant Mumakil like corpse that they made, he was like, oh, it could have been like 50% bigger or like whatever. Like that's what the interpretation was.
Yeah, the big mace that the Witch King of Angmar wielded, the really badass looking mace. It's huge.
Yeah,
he wanted it to be bigger. So it was so huge, like it's ridiculously impractical to wield as a weapon.
Yeah,
but
of course, it's the Witch King of Angmar.
I'm glad that like those people kept Peter like in check.
Yeah.
You know,
because otherwise it would just look crazy. Like even just in the behind the scenes of that mace, it looked too big to be real. But then in the movie, when you watch it, it's perfect. It's just the right amount of size to be menacing and to look fucking dangerous.
Yeah. Back to Gothmog, he was actually partly inspired by the Elephant Man. His name I forgot. He was a real like person. You know, had a name and everything. I feel bad. Yeah. But he's an interesting character, not just because of like the design and like the cool throwback to the Silmarillion, but Peter and the writing team realized that there was a need to make the orcs of Mordor more memorable and more menacing in a way, because we've already had the weird orcs in the first couple of films that are kind of like small. They run like monkeys.
Yeah, they're kind of goblin-like almost.
Yeah, and then you have in the second film, obviously, you have the Uruk-hai, which we see in full force, and they're really badass because they're orcs, but they're like even better because they're extremely good fighters and they're more brutal and like barbaric. So we had to make the orcs of Mordor much more badass.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that they made them actually more focused as opposed to like a huge rabble of enemies. So here they're like in ranks, and they actually have lieutenants that you can like pick out from the scenes. So the guy with like the skull on his head, like that skinny little orc, it was like, where have you been all this time when like the Corsairs come and they land? And then Aragorn and his crew just pop out and like destroys them. Yeah. So it's really interesting that they had like these what they called antagonists in the behind the scenes. These antagonists that the viewers can focus on. So you're not just lost in this mindless rabble of orcs. Like, this is like intended hatred, basically, which is, I think, what Theoden said in the second film, which is like, what can we do against such reckless hate?
Yeah, it's a very good line.
Yeah. And it translates really into any like huge army that Sauron kind of makes, because he just has this undying hatred for like anything living and not under his dominion.
So as we come to the end of our podcast, we must talk about the many endings in Lord of the Rings Return of the King film.
My God, can we even count how many there are? So there's the eagles coming to save Frodo and Sam on Mount Doom. Spoiler alert. If you haven't seen the movies. Then we have the scene where Frodo is lying in bed and the Fellowship come and like hug him, and like he names all of them, and he's like,
what a happy little ending.
Yeah. And Gandalf's laughing in the background. Yeah. Yeah. And then I think they flash forward to... No, and then there's Aragorn's coronation, and he sings that song.
Which probably would, for me, would have been the best if they were to skip like the Grey Havens ending, which is the saddest.
Yeah, if you wanted to skip out on the sad part.
Yeah, Aragorn, just as an aside, Aragorn's coronation was really well done, I think, because he reunites with Arwen.
Yay!
Like, hooray.
Yeah.
And then there's the 4 hobbits dressed in their best hobbit attire ever.
Yeah.
They stand out so much because the colors are just so bright. Glaringly red and orange and green, whatever.
Yeah.
And they look all so handsome and well kept. And it's a really fairy tale ending scene, you know.
Definitely.
Like, I mean, like, literally, the king reunites with the princess type deal, you know, or whatever.
Yeah. And there's that whole light again of like the Minas Tirith light that it just encompasses the entire shot, and it's just so beautiful. And like they all bow down to the hobbits. And isn't that a cute little scene?
Oh, yeah, it's adorable.
Yeah. So then we move on to the Shire, and we see that cute little scene again of that old man who's like, that old hobbit is raking his front yard, and then he sees like the 4 hobbits just trailing in like in these fine clothes, and there's a smile on their faces and nodding at him.
In gilded raiment.
Yes, exactly.
With swords and scabbards.
And they drink a well-earned tankard of ale at the Green Dragon. But then you kind of feel like, well, I think Frodo actually goes into like this voiceover of like how bittersweet the ending is, like some wounds cannot be healed by time, like something like that he speaks about. So you get this feeling of like bittersweetness, which a lot of Tolkien's work is all about. It's the good with the bad sort of thing. And I think that's like an interesting point to think about when you think about good and evil, and how Tolkien like creates these binaries. Well, here's another like piece of evidence that is the contrary, because it's not just good prevailing over evil. There's always
more nuanced for sure.
Yeah, there's always going to be some sort of sorrow that's going to be left over with the happy ending.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then we go to the Grey Havens, and that whole sad I still cry every time like Frodo hugs his companions and then leaves.
Yeah.
I cry every time.
It's so sad.
And then you see like poor little Bilbo getting on the ship, and then Frodo, and then they sail off, and then Sam goes back. By this time you're just like, can we like stop this? And then Sam goes back to his house where he's like with Rosemary. Is that her name?
It's like Rosie, Rosemary.
Something like that.
Who cares?
Yeah.
Little hobbit wife.
Yeah. Goes back, 3 little daughters or children, and
Daughters or children.
well, there's one like little infant that you're not sure like what their gender is. Anyway, and then Sam and then Sam looks out and he's like, well, I'm back. And it's been like a year since he's been back in the Shire, and he's still like flabbergasted that he's back. So that's a very interesting ending. So yeah, those are the many endings of The Return of the King and the trilogy as a whole. So we'll talk about how the ending in the books, which has one more scene added to those many scenes of the militiamen defeating Saruman. Is that more of an appropriate ending to this story, this whole trilogy, or do you think that the movie ending is more appropriate?
This is really complicated because there's a lot of purists out there who did not like the fact that Scouring of the Shire was left out, simply because it just was in the books.
Yeah.
I think it works in the book because it's very personal to Tolkien. And like you brought that up, and so I think maybe you should be the one to explain it. But before we do that, from a cinematic point of view, like I'm not an expert in film or like filmography and blah, 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 cinematography. But I feel like it's just better if the final great menace of Sauron, Mordor, the Ring, etc., is completely vanquished, and then we have a nice resolution. It is bittersweet because there's been such great loss and great toil and hardship, but there's also this great hope that's at the end. And that to me is one of like the greatest things in fantasy, is that there's always this hope that there's something better. There's never this bizarre like fatalistic ending where you say, well, okay, well, evil is just going to prevail inevitably at some point, and
that's science fiction.
Yeah, and I hate that, because you're taking such a great emotional story and then you're just having it kind of squashed by a really depressing ending. You want to feel that satisfaction, and so I think that you feel that at the end. Like, you feel very relieved, and you feel like the time has come. The great turmoil of Middle Earth has passed. There's also the practical for running time. Like, do you really want to have like another hour-long scene of the hobbits returning to the Shire, and then, oh, guess what? Because they didn't actually kill Saruman and Grima, they've rounded up a whole bunch of rowdy-ass dudes, and like they're taking over the Shire, and there's people in chains, and like there's stuff that's been burned down, and it's a big pile of crap. Yeah. And then they have to deal with this new menace, of course.
Yeah, no,
it'd be like annoying to see that in a great epic movie like this. Yes. That has perceivably like this huge conflict, and then they go home and it's not over yet, folks.
And I think it's really interesting because Tolkien's whole idea with these books was to create a myth, but I think for the movies it's more of an epic. It's a bit more structured. Like, there's this whole hero's journey, and in the behind the scenes, like Jackson talks about, like denouement and stuff. So there's a rigid structure that the movies follow. Like, no matter like how elaborate or dramatic everything is, it follows a certain structure. But for Tolkien, he's very much a gardener sort of type of writer, where he just sprouts things and goes along with it. He doesn't have a set structure. And that's really kind of like what a myth is. It's a bit more like rough and not really structured. And I think that works obviously for his writing. But as you said, it doesn't really work from a cinematics. It doesn't really work for a cinematic point of view. It could work for a more modern or contemporary interpretation, because we have a different sort of view of film, or like what a story should be, because we're so fed up with the hero's journey now that we want something fresh to happen at the end, like a cliffhanger or something totally like out of whack. So it could fit now in a more like non-classical interpretation, but Jackson's is very classical and structured, so it really would not fit in. And to talk a bit more about the personal aspect of the Scouring of the Shire, if you think about Tolkien's whole like life experience, it was when he went to the First World War and he fought on the battlefronts. He was fighting so his rural England would not be taken over, would not be in dominion by the Central Powers. And that's a really important sort of like memory for him, because he had a lot of loss and worry and anxiety over that, right? Like, he lost so many of his friends, and he has a lot of devotion to nature and his home and his childhood and all of that. So that's an important scene where like his anxieties really come true and come to light, because the hobbits return back to the Shire and they find that, oh shit, like they destroyed the ring, but they're still evil. Their world has been destroyed still somehow because they weren't there.
Yeah.
And it makes sense in a huge sort of long-term idea of myth making, because this is just one age of evil. Like, there's so many ages, and just because like one great evil is destroyed does not mean like the root of it is destroyed.
Exactly. And to talk about Sauron in the book, when he's defeated, he isn't exactly killed. He's still kind of like this shadow that gnaws itself, and it doesn't really take shape ever again. It's still there, though.
Yeah.
And the fact that he's still there somehow is unsettling to the reader, ultimately. At least for what was for me.
Yeah, totally. You never get that sense of like complete closure, especially since Frodo is like himself kind of maimed. He lost his finger, as we importantly pointed out before. But he also has this unsettling realization that he can't stay in Middle Earth and he has to go somewhere else where he can like kind of reconcile everything he's gone through.
So with that, folks, thank you for listening to the 3-part Lord of the Rings discussions.
And if you're craving for more Tolkien, we're actually going to talk about specific characters and scenes and other books by Tolkien, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, and The Unfinished Tales.
Check out the description of this video and you can see the different platforms we put our content on, as well as our social media links. Thanks again and see you next time.